Let's talk about measuring and monitoring data quality, or how do we know if our data is actually high quality? The first question, of course, is why do we even bother? Why do we even want to measure and monitor our data quality? I think the first thing is that it makes it less subjective. For example, at the beginning of Wikidata, there were a lot of discussions about either how amazing or how terrible Wikidata's data quality is, and someone would pull up an item and say like, look, this item is totally amazing, and someone else would go like, but look, here's vandalism on this one, it's terrible. And there isn't much, there's a lot of subjectivity in that, that I don't think is helping us in these bigger discussions, because we only ever look at an individual item or an individual edit, and it's very hard to get a sense of what Wikidata as a whole looks like, or specific sub-parts of Wikidata look like. And the other thing is, I think we want to understand better where we are in terms of data quality and where we are going. Like, are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Are we staying the same? And I think we want to understand which aspects of data quality we want to prioritize with, for example, new tools my team and I are building, or events we're doing to work on specific aspects of data quality, to name just a few. And to wrap our head around this big concept of data quality, and Alessandro Piscopo looked at different existing frameworks to classify data quality in linked data. And he specifically then developed a framework for how to think about data quality on Wikidata and what different aspects it has. And it's a useful way to think about the different aspects that data quality has for Wikidata. And in this model, there are different categories. For example, there's an intrinsic category. So these are dimensions that do not depend on what you want to use the data for. They're just about the data itself. And there's stuff like accuracy. So is this data actually accepted as true and free of error, as verifiable? Is it objective? So is the data free of bias and impartial? There's a dimension of reputation. Are the references we have for it trustworthy? There's consistency. Like, is this data modeled in a consistent way with other similar data or related data? Another category is contextual. So these things depend on what you want to use the data for. And this includes stuff like timeliness. Is the data up to date? Or is it up to date enough for what you want to do, or what you want to use it for? And then there's completeness, which can be either on the schema level. So do we have enough classes and properties? It can be on the item level. Does this item have all the relevant statements that it should have? Does it have all the labels that it should have? And so on. And it can be on the population level. So do we have all the instances of that class that we want to have, or that we need to make a certain application possible we want to enable? And then we have representational things or dimensions, like interoperability. So this is about how, or if this data can be interpreted by a machine without ambiguity, which in Wikidata we are actually rather good at with all the external identifiers and QIDs we have. that definitely helps with understanding for machines and not bringing in ambiguity there. And in the same representational category is ease of understanding. So can this data be interpreted by a human without ambiguity? So this would be stuff like you have two items with the label Berlin. Do we have enough information for a human to tell them apart? Like, for example, a description that makes it clear that one is Berlin, a city in Germany, and the other one is a music album by that title. And last, we have accessibility. So with the interlinking dimension. So this is asking, is this data interlinked to other data sources, other resources? Can we find more data based on the links, for example, in external identifiers that we have? So with all these different dimensions that we have, we already measure and better understand some of them, and some of them we don't. So what do we currently have? We have the ORS score. So ORS is a machine learning system that does various jobs in Wikimedia. One of them is judge a quality class for an item on Wikidata. It also judges edits on Wikidata and Wikipedia. It also judges the quality of a Wikipedia article, or tries to. So one of the things it does is give each Wikidata item a quality class from A, very good, very complete, to E, very incomplete, rather terrible quality. So here, for example, you can see dog as an item with the class A quality, so very high quality. It has lots of statements, it has lots of labels, it has lots of references, and so on. And here you have another item with just one statement, very few labels, and generally not very high quality. ORS gave it an E. Now, this is definitely not perfect as a way to judge quality, because it looks at completeness of the item, but for example, not verifiability, or it doesn't try to verify any of the statements on that item, because it's not able to do that. But it still gives us one way to understand one dimension of quality across all of Wikidata, right? We can then analyze, okay, all of Wikidata, how is it developing? Certain subsets of Wikidata, how are they developing? How are they right now? And for example, you can then also use it in tools like the item quality evaluator, where you can give it a Spark query or a list of item IDs, and then it will give you a list of all the items you wanted and their score. So here, for example, I queried for cats, and apparently we have one cat with a quality score of 1.11, which is fairly bad. So if anyone is into cats, this is one thing you can try to improve by, for example, adding more references, adding more labels, adding more statements, and so on. And the other thing that it allows us here is to look at Wikidata over time as a complete thing. So what you see here is how, since the beginning of Wikidata, has the quality of our items as judged by ORS developed. And as you can see, it's pretty steadily increasing, which is very good. And then we can also look at subsets of Wikidata, like here. This is the ORS score over time for all items exact scientific papers and astronomical objects. And one thing you will notice is that, for example, this bump here is only in the set that has scientific articles and astronomical objects. Another thing that helps us understand quality are the constraints violations, as you can see here. You see this little flag. If you go on it, this statement doesn't have a reference for place of birth, but we decided that place of birth should generally have a reference. So we get a constraints violation. And that is a different type of quality than the one that ours judges, but it's still a very useful way to understand the quality of our data. And then you can, for example, do things like use a script we've written called the constraint violation checker, which you provide with a list of item IDs, or let it take a random number of item IDs. And then it checks for each of those items, how many statements are on that item, how many constraints violations are on that item, how many of those are at the mandatory, normal, or suggestion level, how many site links are on that item, and how many site links to Wikipedia are on that item. And then you can import that into a spreadsheet and do analysis and, for example, find the item in your set with the most constraints violations. So, but now the question is, what we have is not covering all the aspects of quality, and they give us just a partial view of quality on Wikidata. And now the question I have for you is, what are we missing that you think matters? And what are your ideas for measuring it? And to make this a bit easier, I bring back the classification from Alexandro. So you can see that. Yeah, and with that, I would love to hear your thoughts, either in the chat or on audio, if you want. Nicola is asking, is there a tool specific for the quality of lexemes? He's always using ad hoc queries. I don't think we have any tool yet that covers any aspects of lexeme besides querying. Yeah, that is clearly a thing we're missing. Yet, exactly. That is clearly something that should change. And to do that, maybe one good thing would be to define what a high quality lexeme is a bit better, and how it's different from a low quality lexeme, for example. And Dara is asking, authenticity. Is there a way to tell if the data is the same as what was originally provided? Yeah, this is this is a really good question, and I'm not sure it's covered in any of the things we have so far. It's definitely something that is important, right? If we have a statement on Wikidata that has a value and a reference, and at some point someone goes and changes the value but not the reference, it makes it look like that data is still referenced, but we don't actually know that. So yeah, some comparison in that direction is definitely helpful. We have done a bit in that direction in the past, but nothing yet that really gives us clear results there. So what we did was look at statements on Wikidata that do not have a reference, and then look at sources on the web that are linked from the item through external identifiers, for example, and see if there's the same data in those websites, so we can use them as a reference or suggest them as a reference. But I think what Dara is suggesting is going even a bit further, and I think it's something that we should check. And then, as Simon is saying, signed statements. Yes, I am still very much a fan of signed statements. For those who don't know what that is, the idea was that, for example, if an institution is a source for a particular type of data, then we can have them in some ways sign that statement and say, like, yes, this value and our reference match, and until someone changes something, this signature stays and can be verified. And if someone changes, for example, the value, then that signature would break, and it would be obvious that someone has tampered with that value in a way that may be not intended, or maybe intended, but still needs someone to look at because, for example, the reference would need to be updated, or the other side where it was coming from needs to be notified. Then Jim is saying image quality. Is the metadata checked and coordinated with structured data on comments, plus the quality of the image? Yeah, that is also a very good point. Do we actually have a good and representative image of that item if we have an image in it? Yeah. And John Red is wondering if integrality would make sense and would work on the themes. Definitely worth a try. If you, also everyone else, if you haven't tried integrality, give it a try. It's really cool. And it definitely is one of the things that helps with completeness of data. And then Jim is asking living people data quality, so self-reported versus reliable sources or no sources. Yeah. So we have some of those, I think, in constraints, where we have mandatory constraints that certain data should not be present without a reliable source or without a reference. But I'm not entirely sure how well that is covered. But it's definitely worth investigating that. For constraints for data quality assurance, is it possible to apply cultural context? Can you elaborate what you mean there exactly in, for data quality? And Asset is saying, I'd love an easy way to subset queries by items or statements I created or edited to improve some of my earlier edits. Is this something other people would also do? Query for their, or query for parts of their edits? Own edits? Susanna is asking about how about sanctity of the data, if a place is sacred for a community. For me, I'm not sure if this is an aspect of data quality, but more of how we decide which content should be on Wikidata or not. Yeah, and I'm not sure if that is really data quality, but maybe in the end, if the question is, should this data be on Wikidata or not? And does this take into account cultural context and similar things? Yeah. Okay, then Sarah is asking, does timeliness or newness matter? Yeah, so timeliness is definitely one of the dimensions. And the tricky thing about timeliness is that it does depend on what you want to use it for, right? Let's say you're reporting on elections that just happened. Then you want data on the result of this election and all the items related to the people who were elected and so on to be up to date right now, because you want to report on it, and you need today's data, not yesterday's data, because the election yesterday hadn't happened. But in other cases, it might not really matter if you have data that is up to date to today or was last updated a week ago or so. So yeah, it's definitely a thing, but tricky. David is saying, I don't know what I would call this dimension or in which category it belongs, but are there any other statements that contradict this statement? For example, two persons both have statements that claim that they are the mayor of a town without reasonable qualifiers. I guess this overlaps with the points of correctness and up-to-dateness. Yeah, a bit, I think. And I guess this is something that, at least in part, we can catch with constraints already at the moment. Yeah. Emma is saying some problems with data quality can't really be tackled unless we solve the Bonnie and Clyde problem. This is especially true for institutions that mostly share their items with the buildings they are housed in, but also municipalities and the hamlets they include. I'm not sure how that requires solving the Bonnie and Clyde problem as opposed to just splitting the item or having 3 items. And then you can put the statements in the right item, I would assume. And then we have sometimes references only prove a certain subset of qualifiers of a claim. For example, the start date or the end time. Is there currently any way to annotate which qualifiers are proven by which references, and could this information be used in a data quality assessment? And that's a good point. I don't think we have good ways to currently tackle this. Do you feel this is a widespread problem? Okay, yeah, it definitely does make verifying references harder, right? Because you don't know which part of the identifier actually is covered by the reference and which isn't. Okay, and then there's references only applying to some of the qualifiers happens a lot with political data. For example, different sources for the start date and end date of someone holding a position. Yes, seems to be very reasonable. Okay, that's good to know. Then Mikidata is asking, is there any good practice how to communicate errors back to the sources? Unfortunately, right now, no. I hope that with what we're building now with the Mismatch Finder, we are getting there. We're getting closer to it. But right now we do not have really good practices of how to do this, especially since many of those organizations don't have standardized processes for taking in those error reports from us either. So it's a bit difficult. But it's definitely something we need to improve because we want to solve those issues upstream, right, if possible. Not even back to the Wikipedia universe. Well, for the Wikipedia universe, I guess the answer is go and edit the article or write on the talk page. But that's much closer to us than most of the others, right? And Emma was saying, I write to institutions all the time, mostly by email. The Library of Congress is one of the only institutions that never react. Most are happy about error reports. Yes, I have that impression too, that there is a willingness to work with those. But what I was referring to is that I at least am not aware of a standardized process that works for all the institutions. And I'm not sure if us emailing someone for every single error is a scalable process. But maybe in the end, sending an email or filling out a contact form is one of the things that we have to do. And yeah, Andrea saying he's written like 20 different emails about items with mistakes, but didn't get a reaction. Yeah, that's not great. So maybe we can identify institutions some of us had really good experiences with and work with them to create a smoother process for them, and then use that as examples for other institutions to follow. I remember that, for example, the German National Library worked with the German language Wikipedia to get corrections between Wikipedia and German National Library working nicely. And maybe we can identify more of these institutions that are willing and able to work more closely with us. Ed is suggesting maybe there could be a place to record those problems publicly. Yeah. Do you mean like on Wikidata itself? As they are suggesting that a log of errors in the source could become its own single topic journal that librarians and information scientists read. Here's your monthly report from the upstream's error log. Yeah, I like that. A hall of shame. Well, I don't think we should see it quite as hall of shame, but maybe. Andrea is saying it might also help to get a process within Wikidata to make such reports. They might be more interested if it comes from official Wikidata in bunches, more or less checked, than from someone who's basically just a volunteer. I wish this weren't true, but I fear you might be right. TBT is saying, what about an API on a mismatch finder that would allow, for example, the DNB to upload their mismatches? That's exactly what the mismatch finder will have. So how it will work is that the mismatch, the German National Library, for example, can upload their mismatches that they found when analyzing their data against Wikidata into the mismatch finder. And then people can review the mismatches that they provided and say, okay, this is an error in Wikidata, this is an error in the German National Library, or this is neither, and it should be the way it is. Yeah, Immo's talking about these institutions having a backlog of many, many days because they have so much update in their data. That is definitely a problem, right? Before they can get to something we notify them about. And Phoebe is talking about sometimes these errors are obvious and sometimes it's a difference in cataloging standards, which then gets trickier. Yeah. And the moment it gets trickier, it's probably also going to take more time to get it resolved. Victor is asking, one of the quality aspects was consistency. Could we set up a wiki to communicate the preferred way to implement things that could be implemented in many ways? Yes. So in part, this is what entity schemas are actually supposed to be doing, right? They're supposed to, in a machine and probably also human readable way, codify modeling decisions. And right now, they're definitely not integrated enough and not usable enough. But that was the idea behind entity schemas. And if you're interested in entity schemas, you should totally go to Kat's session and learn about how to write one. But if those are more integrated into editing workflows and less of a completely separate part of Wikidata that is very hard to understand and only very few people right now use, I think then that is a good way forward in codifying how we decided on certain modeling that could be done in different ways. Emma is saying one general problem, we also have that on Wikidata, is that there is more glory in creating dozens of items instead of just correcting one in the same time. Correcting errors can be really hard. Yes, it can be totally hard. And I think a part of the thing that we can change is to get away from there is no glory in maintenance and move towards valuing more, recognizing more people who are doing really important and really cool maintenance work, and who are cleaning up specific parts of Wikidata that they really care about. But this is up to us, right? We have the power to to point these people out and value their work in private and in public. And I don't think it would hurt to do that, especially given that it's such important work. And Victor, yes, exactly. This is the area for entity schemas I was talking about. And what you link to is the list of schemas that we currently have. There's also a help page about schemas as a whole. So you're saying also batch maintenance is difficult. Could you explain what would be helpful for batch maintenance, or what currently makes it difficult? So the suggestion is to have tools to identify common errors that can all be fixed at once, like with quick statements. I think that's what a lot of people do with some maintenance queries. For example, they query for, just the other day on Twitter, I saw people who are both, who have the same person as son and father. There's definitely something going wrong there. So someone writes a query to get all the items where this is the case, and then in this case has to do it manually. But if it's a maintenance query for a particular type of quality error that can be fixed on a larger scale without having to look into the details, then exporting that query result and creating a quick statements batch is definitely something that can be done. And then Frederick is asking about how about external identifier quality. There are external identifiers that clearly are exact matches, some that are blatant inaccurate matches, and then all the fuzzy matches in between. This can lead to an item being seemingly correctly linked to two external identifiers that aren't matches to one another. Besides qualifying external identifiers with named as, are there other ways to minimize incorrect external ID statements? I have seen other qualifiers used to indicate a broader match or a narrower match. But I'm not sure if that is a generally agreed upon way to do this. I've seen it quite a few times on scientific articles and DOIs, for example. And DBT wrote a paper about identifying common corrections to apply to Wikidata, focusing on constraints violations. Yes, that research could, for example, be used to run bots that make some of those common corrections, and to better understand what kind of common mistakes people make all the time, and so that we can figure out why these same mistakes are being made all the time, and maybe change something in the interface or in labels of items and so on. SJ has a question for Kat. How should we think about schema quality? Properties of schemas seem like part of it, but it feels confusing to create a separate entity schema for each. Do you want to talk about the quality of an entity schema? And Kat is saying that they haven't heard of any proposed metrics for quality for entity schemas as applied to Wikidata yet. Yeah, it might be a bit too early entity schemas to have a good sense of what quality means for them in Wikidata. I think we need to use them more and understand them more and integrate them more in the processes we have to really figure out what makes a good entity schema versus a not so great one. Emma was asking, how would you feel about a set of properties like error report, filed at, on date, etc., to show that somebody has noticed an error and filed a report? Not sure if double reporting is a real problem, but it would also show that there's a problem and somebody is working on it. People think about that? It's maybe something you could bring up on the project chat for a wider discussion. Daniels is asking, how do you see the use of controlled vocabularies, cataloging rules, and domain models, Ferber, CRM, and so on, in planning metadata records? Daniela, are you asking how much or little we want to align with other existing models and vocabularies and how we model the same type of data? So he's saying, I think it depends on the entity type and what data models already exist in Wikidata. Yeah, and I think that's right. For some, aligning with an external domain model and vocabularies makes sense, and in other cases, maybe not. All right, we have about 5 minutes left. Does anyone have additional things we're currently not measuring but should be, or ideas for how we could be measuring any of the things we talked about? Jim is saying +1 to glory. Maybe we need resources to celebrate quality circle that patrols quality reports and improves quality at citation contests and things like that. Yeah. Stuff like one lib, one ref, I think are great, and we should have more of it. And then Egon is asking, what about quality control of literal values? Can we feed such analysis into a QA system too? For example, incorrect smiles for chemical compounds. Egon, can you clarify what you mean by feed that into a QA system? Like you, yeah, example would be good. Okay, propane, for example, has a smiles CCC. That one is simple. It has a molecular mass. Those values in statements can be strings, and those can of course be wrong. Yeah. And the results of checking those I can put on a page. Yes. Can I also have it show up like constraints messages? Ah, okay. Now I think I get what you mean. So basically you have checked a bunch of statements on Wikidata, you found that some of them are wrong. And can I now make them show up next to the statements like a constraints violation? So far you cannot do that, but with the Mismatch Finder, you will be able to at least load it into the Mismatch Finder's store. And then the Mismatch Finder has an API, and I imagine, for example, someone could write a gadget that accesses the API of the Mismatch Finder and asks, okay, for this item I'm on, are there any constraints violations, any issue reports in the Mismatch Finder about any of the statements on this item? And then could show a similar icon like the constraints violation. So Not yet, but hopefully possible soon. And David is saying, just for those who don't know what SMILES is, it's a notation for the structure of chemical elements. It has property P233. Cool. And then Victor saying, would humans systematically checking a subset of Wikidata be a valuable analysis and training data set for quality control problems? So basically having a human review individual statements for a large part of items and then use that to, for example, train some machine learning model, or yeah, it could be worth exploring, I would say. All right, and it seems Wiki Project Chemistry, for example, is already doing that. Probably not just them. Yeah, would be good to look at some of those examples of what people already do in these reviews. Victor is asking, are such conflicts then stored somewhere for analysis? Would be cool. All right. Yeah, if you can find some of them, Egon, that would be useful. Then we can look at them. Okay, one last question from SJ before we wrap it up. Is there a project for people building machine models to improve quality in some area? I don't think there is a good place yet, but maybe we should create one. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And with that, I would say we wrap it up. Thank you so much, everyone, for the discussion and input. That was super helpful. Let's see what we can make of it. Thanks so much.